Further ado, we now move to the main business of the evening, which is to hear a talk by Owen Bennett-Jones. It's just a bit about Owen. He is a journalist and former BBC correspondent. He's been based around 7 countries. He's also the author of a history of Pakistan titled Pakistan Eye of the Storm. I believe he'll be addressing the Union today on extremism in the UK and what makes an extremist. So, over to you.
Good, so good evening to all of you. Just a little bit of introduction. I've been roaming around a lot of conflict zones over the last 20-25 years, and I've seen a lot of young men with guns and wondered, obviously, as you interact with these people, what's going through their head, why they're doing it, what drives them, what motivates them. And I guess the obvious explanation that comes to mind, first of all, is that it's a religious matter. I've been travelling mainly in Pakistan, Iraq, Middle East, and that it's a religious matter, and it's some religiously driven ideas that are causing them to take to violence. But that is not necessarily the case. And in this talk, I'm going to just briefly explain a bit about the different groups that are out there, the different militant groups, particularly in Pakistan, and it's some relevance to the UK, because virtually everything that happens in Pakistani politics, whether it's religious jihadism, violent jihadism, or just party politics, or ethnic politics, or tribal politics, all happens here in the UK, particularly in this part of the UK. And there are echoes of everything that happens in Pakistan here in Britain, generally less violently, but not entirely. We've had a political assassination in London amongst the Pakistani community, and we've had sectarian killing. There was an Ahmadi guy, the Ahmadis are a minority in Pakistan, who was killed in Glasgow by somebody who came up from Bradford to kill him, so that was our first sectarian killing. We've had a political assassination in North London, and of course the jihadist violence, which we see week in, week out, just an example, very recently in London. So all these things are happening in the UK, generally less violently, but they're the same political fissures and tensions that lead to them, and it's not entirely religious. So just to sort of give you a sense of how complicated this all is, in Pakistan, if you sort of take the main militant groups, by which I mean, a sort of thoroughgoing proper militant group who could organise someone's murder, let's say, within a week. Say someone they identify they want to kill, that they could get it organised, get it done, get people to do it, get it all worked out, and have them dead within a week. So there are probably about 50 groups like that. And they all come from different places, and they're doing different things. So I will run through some of the motivations of groups like that. So the ones that you will know about, global jihad. So people like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, whose drive is to turn the world entirely Muslim. And they are obviously on the back foot. Al-Qaeda was a very big deal in Pakistan for many years. Bin Laden was living in Pakistan, northern Pakistan. And I mean, for what it's worth, there are people here who oppose the drone strikes, which you may well, which I have to say at one stage I did rather, but having looked at it, the drone strikes were what destroyed Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. It made it impossible for them to operate, and it's a complicated issue, many civilian casualties, but the drone strikes did basically finish Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. And then there's Islamic State, who you all know about, and is obviously on the back foot. But these are global jihadists. There are then different groups that are resisting foreign occupation, particularly in Kashmir, which is disputed territory between India and Pakistan. And as far as the Pakistanis are concerned, it is illegally occupied by India, and there are Kashmiri fighters and there are Pakistani fighters who are fighting on behalf of the Kashmiris. So two distinct groups. There are nationalist Kashmiris who are fighting. There are more religiously inspired Kashmiris and Pakistanis who are fighting on behalf of the Kashmir nation. So it's quite complicated. There'll be 30 or 40 groups in Kashmir, all with different ideas, different leadership structures, different funding arrangements, different ideologies, but they're all fighting against the Indian forces. And then you've got the same thing in Afghanistan, where you've got Western forces who are in Afghanistan with the Afghan Taliban and a whole lot of other groups fighting the Western forces in Afghanistan. So that is our second group. We've got these global jihadists, now we've got these nationalists or religiously inspired fighters resisting foreign occupation. Then we've got groups that are just anti-state, trying to turn Pakistan in particular into an Islamic state. So these are the Pakistan Taliban, quite distinct from the Afghan Taliban. Often the Taliban are, and the general tendency in Western policy circles is to merge all these groups into one. They're just like all jihadis. But they're not, they're all completely different. And it's particularly clear in the case of the Taliban, where people talk about the Taliban, but there's the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban have completely different objectives. The Afghan Taliban are trying to get rid of foreign forces in Afghanistan and maybe get a share of government. The Pakistan Taliban are trying to overthrow the complete state structure and impose their system, theocracy, in Pakistan. So a completely different setup. They do cooperate, it's really confusing. There are people who go and fight from both of them. There are Pakistani madrasas, that's Islamic seminaries, that will, when the Afghan Taliban are on the back foot, will send some of their guys, the head of the madrasa will say, go, they need help, go and fight, you've got a month off, come back in a month. And so there is cooperation like that, but to show you just how complex this is and how politics can help resolve these matters, the Afghan Taliban will never help the Pakistan Taliban, because the Afghan Taliban are supported by the Pakistan state, and therefore they would not want to come back to Pakistan and fight the Pakistan state. So politics has found a solution for the Pakistanis of how to deal with the Afghan Taliban. They can support them in Afghanistan fighting Western forces, but not allow them to cross the border and do things in Pakistan. It's even more complicated than that. The Pakistan Taliban is not just an anti-state pro-theocracy movement, it is also a tribal outfit run by the Masud tribe, who are in Waziristan, fiercely independent. If you've ever come across them, you probably haven't, but if you go around that area, they have houses which are remarkable, because from every single angle from the house, they've got gun slots, and they've got everything covered, 360 degrees around each house, fiercely independent. And they run the Pakistan Taliban. For one brief period, the Pakistan Taliban fell under the leadership of a non-Masud, and the whole thing went wrong for them. They found it was much easier for the Pakistan state to again use politics to undermine them, getting tribal groups to oppose them on tribal grounds rather than religious grounds. And so the organisation has reverted now to a Masud leader. There are another set of groups who are basically freelance operators who the best example is this outfit called the Haqqani Network, who have a level of sophistication that puts British politicians to complete shame. I mean, these are some of the most extraordinarily sophisticated operators. They use violent jihad. They're the first people who involved bin Laden in Afghanistan, and they play everyone. So they do things for the Pakistan state, bombing targets like the Indian embassy in Kabul. They do things for the Pakistan Taliban, training their fighters. They do things for the Afghan Taliban. The head of the Haqqani Network is actually the deputy leader of the Afghan Taliban. And they just do crime, transport business, drugs business. They are very, very smooth operators, and they've been going for about 40 years. A lot of the senior Haqqani's family members have been killed over the years, assassinated, but nonetheless they do this extraordinary thing of providing services to the Afghan state, the Pakistan state, the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, and somehow keeping afloat all the while through it. You've got another set of groups who are sectarian. So just fighting, most famous, sort of best known conflict is Shia-Sunni, but in fact most of the deaths in Pakistan probably are intra-Sunni. So different groups of Sunni Muslims who are fighting each other. And that gets really complicated, because some of them are going into parliamentary politics with the encouragement of the Pakistan state, who's trying to undermine them by that, and others are joining Al-Qaeda, or the remnants of Al-Qaeda. So that gets complicated, because there are people who are overlapping in these affiliations and ideologies. There are groups that are just opposed to India, and who just want to fight the Indians, whether they be in Kashmir or in India itself. So to give you an example of how violent jihadist politics work, I'll cite the case of the Mumbai attacks. You may remember, I can't remember what year it was, about 10 years ago now, and about 140 people were killed in Mumbai by 6 guys who went over there and started blowing everyone up and shooting. And they, if you remember, they went through one of the main hotels, luxury hotel in Mumbai, and shot a lot of people. So the reason that happened was quite interesting. It was a group called Lashkar-e-Toiba did it, who were a big outfit, and they had been very big in Kashmir. General Musharraf, who was the Pakistani dictator, was trying to de-escalate in Kashmir. So he told all his militants to back off. So if you're running a militant group, one of the problems you've got is you've got to keep everyone busy. You can't, and it's true, the IRA faced the same problem, you can't keep everyone on hold, saying just get ready until the politics are straight, we'll go back to violence. You've got to keep them doing stuff. Otherwise they'll go to another group who is doing stuff. So they were saying, oh, we're not doing much in Kashmir, we're being demobilised in Kashmir, what are we going to do? So there was a debate in Lashkar-e-Toiba as to how to manage this, and some said we should just join the Pakistan Taliban and fight the Pakistan state, and others said no, our whole funding comes from the Pakistan state, so we don't want to do that, we want to keep the Pakistan state sweet. So someone said, well, maybe we could go to Afghanistan then and fight with the Afghan Taliban, fight the Westerners. No, well, that's not a great plan because there are lots of other groups doing that, and our whole thing has always been India, so it's better to stick with India. So then someone came up with this Mumbai idea, absolutely solved every problem. High profile attack in India, big morale booster for the LET fighters, exactly what was needed. Solved all their problems in terms of tactics and strategy. So they did it, and that gives you some indication of the thinking that would go into putting together why they would launch a particular attack at a particular time. So that's some of the range of groups that are out there in Pakistan. So to what extent are they driven by religious ideology? There are reasons to think that they're not driven by religious ideology. You may have read the stories about some of these guys going out to Syria from Birmingham with Islam for Dummies in their backpack. They didn't know much about religion. So it's difficult to think that this was religiously inspired. And if you talk to many non-believing Muslims, they would also feel very strongly about some of the same issues that religious, very zealous Muslims would think about. I remember after 9/11, I went to Peshawar, so waiting for the fall of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. And there was this guy who was a professor he was like a Shakespearean scholar in Peshawar. And I knew him, and I knew he wasn't religious at all. And he was like, with 9/11 the Americans got what was coming to them. I was like, whoa. And he had no religion in him at all. It was a cultural response to American aggression and imperialism over the years. So not religiously driven. I'll give you another example. There was a guy, I asked the Pakistani police people if they could show me some of these jihadis in Lahore. And they took me to this guy who was quite young, he's only 17 or something. And I said, so what happened? He said, well, I was working on it as a home, there's no money. So I went to work in a factory when he was, I think, 13, he went to work in some horrible factory, and he met a bloke there who was the same age as him, doing the same thing, earning nothing, obviously, and then they I think he made bricks or something. And then they scrabbled enough money together to go to the cinema. He'd never been to the cinema. So the two of them thought, we'll go to the film in Lahore. So they're walking, 10 miles from their horrible factory in the outskirts of Lahore, and they get to the middle of town, and then there was this there's a group called Jaish-e-Mohammed, who were quite big here in Britain, very big in Pakistan. And they were having a rally. And they were saying, yeah, these mullahs were all there saying, anyone who wants to go to Afghanistan, now's the time, fight the Americans, nothing like it. So these two guys go, you know, well, it'd be quite fun to see a foreign country. That was his main thing. He said, I thought it'd be good to see another country, really. So he said, okay. And there was like a group that said, if you want to fight, go this way. So they said, okay, they do it. So they ended up in this coach and were driven to Kandahar. And he said it was very embarrassing because he didn't know how to pray. He said, my dad never did, really, and I didn't know what to do. And then there was all these Taliban were like praying all the time, and it was like quite awkward. And anyway, this guy took him aside and taught him how to pray. And then he had this terrible, terrible experience where he ended up in there's a town in the north of Afghanistan. Mazar-e-Sharif. He ended up in Mazar-e-Sharif. And it was just, if you study this stuff, you'll know that there was a moment of Taliban control, and then the Americans came in, and it was like this catastrophe. They all these Taliban fighters ended up in a fort, being terribly mistreated, and then they escaped, and a group of them then got caught by some Pakistan tribal guy who wanted to sell them to the Americans, and put them all in a container. So they're all in a container in the middle of nowhere. And then this guy thought the Americans wouldn't play ball, so he just shoot them. So he went round a container and just shot the container. But all his guys just riddled it with bullets. And my bloke was just very, very lucky. It sort of hit the bottom of the floor early, so all the bullets went over his head. So about 6 of them lived. When they opened it up, it was like lots of dead people and these 6 guys. So then he ended up in a prison in Kabul, and then he got the Pakistan High Commissioner, our ambassador, came and got him out, and he ended up going to a whole series of prisons. Ended up in Lahore with my police guy. Said, meet him, he's quite an interesting bloke. All because he was trying to go see a film. So that was his story, and it was a very casual jihadi. I mean, he had no interest in jihadism whatsoever, but it gives you some impression of how they found their recruits. So what was driving him? You know, excitement. Maybe masculinity, a desire to do what his father had never done and prove himself a bit as a man. Sometimes there's a class element to it. So I met a man in the Swat Valley, which was run by the Taliban for about a year. And he had beheaded 8 people in the basement of some horrible basement with a knife. And I was like, why would you do that? And he said, well, the Taliban came, and his story was that he came from an ethnic group in Swat who were like the underdogs. There were 2 groups there, and he was always... So his life was going to be horrible, really, like it had been for his countless generations before him. His father sold shoelaces or something, had some ridiculous stall in Swat, and making no money at all. So he thought, when the Taliban came, they said, if you join us, we'll give you land. So he thought nothing like it, and joined them, and did their bidding, killed these people, including one of his teachers, who's been watching videos or something, and they said that was un-Islamic. So he did all this, and then he was really upset, because he said, you know, they didn't give me the land. I didn't get the land. Yeah, I did the killing. And they double-crossed me, and they gave all their land to their more powerful bodyguards and people, so I never got anything out of it. But he was driven, really, by a sort of class politics, really, of trying to overthrow the landowners of the Swat Valley and to get their resources. So then there's, as well as class politics, there's nationalist politics, tribal politics I mentioned in relation to the Masuds and the Pakistan Taliban. There are ethnic groups, the Pashtuns, who were fighting the British, fighting the Pakistanis. So, for example, if you go to Waziristan, which is one of these tribal areas on the border with Afghanistan, there's a place there where I saw, I don't know if you're aware of the word defile. It's the first time I came across the word defile, which is a sort of very narrow valley where only one column of troops could go through. And the Brits had been there in 1934 and had been attacked by a man called the Fakir of Ipi, who attacked the Brits and killed quite a few of them. It was a big British moment. And then the Pakistanis were there, in like 2008, and exactly the same thing happened in exactly the same place. And you can see on the valley wall, this was a big sheer drop, bullet holes from both those incidents 70 years apart. So, was it anti-imperialism? Were the Pakistanis imperialists? The British were imperialists. Were the Pakistanis imperialists? They might say so. So it was a nationalist thing, but it was also, it was led by a religious cleric in 1934, and again in 2004 it was led by the Taliban, so it's sort of religious. So it's confusing again. There are different things going on. Anti-imperialistic, nationalist, religious. So all I'm trying to say really is it's very, very complicated. And if you want to tackle these groups in Pakistan, you need to understand all this, and you need to understand what each group is doing, why they're doing it, what their reasons are, what their motivations are, what their ideology is, and how you might go about undermining that ideology and tackling what they've got to say. So what about the religious sources of all of this? So it's quite interesting looking at what happened to Tony Blair and David Cameron, who both went on exactly the same journey, if you want to call it that, as people do at this day and age, sort of the same progression in their thought. 2001, after 9/11, Tony Blair said to the Labour Party conference, the true followers of Islam are our brothers and sisters in this struggle. Bin Laden is no more obedient to the proper teaching of the Quran than those crusaders of the 12th century who pillaged and murdered represented the gospel. So he's saying that the true Muslim would not support Bin Laden. In 2014, he said this: people are fighting. He says, in a speech to Bloomberg's headquarters in London, he surveyed the various front lines on which violent jihadists were fighting, and he argued that while each battleground had its own characteristics and complexities derived from tribe, tradition and territory, the sort of thing I've been talking about, such factors were of limited importance in explaining what was happening. Western commentators, people like me, he complained, go to amazing lengths to deny that these conflicts are about Islam. So in 2001, it's got nothing to do with Islam, true Islam. 2014, it's all about Islam. That's what Blair, that was his progression. It's all about Islam. Instead of arguing that it's about local or historical factors were more important, it's odd, he said, to deny that Islam is the central element of what's going on. So Blair completely changed his mind, and Cameron did exactly the same thing. I won't go through the quotes, but he started off saying there's nothing to do with Islam, and ended up saying it's all to do with Islam. Now then, if you look at what's happened in the UK, the violent jihadist attacks we've had here, in the newspapers, generally speaking, it's described as Salafi, I don't know if you've come across these terms, Salafi, Wahhabi violence. And it's actually it's a mistake, because it isn't. And I think it's happened because the 9/11 attacks were indeed Salafi, Wahhabi jihadists who came from Saudi Arabia and Yemen and places, and this was their religious ideology. In the UK, they're not important, and there are very few of them. And the people doing all these attacks, like these two we've just had in London in the last few weeks, come from a different group called Deobandis, a phrase that is hardly known in Britain, a word, and I have to say, hardly known to the British government, even though, it's trying to combat this problem. So precisely what I've been talking about in Pakistan, where the Pakistan government, who is actually quite good at this, and they do understand the 60 groups they're up against and all their different motivations and ideologies and sects and all the rest of it, they get all this stuff. In the UK, we've got the wrong group. It's not Salafis and Wahhabis, it's Deobandis. Now the Deobandis originate in India. There's a town north of Delhi, about an hour's drive from Delhi. I've been to this place. It's got thousands of religious students, and they are very conservative. And they have this arrangement where it's like the opposite of the Catholic Church. So where the Pope says something and that's it for the whole of the Catholics around the world, the Deobandis have a completely opposite approach, and they span everything from this group in India who have declared themselves to be opposed to terrorism in a big convention which the Indian government helped organise. they range from that to Mullah Omar, head of the Afghan Taliban, who's Deobandi, and is, was, before he was killed, extremely violent. So there is this big range of Deobandi practice in terms of whether they're violent or not. And in the UK, and I'll go to questions before too long, but just to run through a bit of this, in the UK, they are a very big deal, and they have, the Deobandis, control of 43% of British mosques, right? So they're important. And they have quite a few seminaries in Britain where people are being trained in religious conservative thought. Now, the interesting thing about the Deobandis is that the Indians have managed to control it by pretty ruthless suppression of these students. So there's one young man I met in Deobandi who's from Kashmir. Well, Kashmir is a flashpoint, right? So I said to him, he's Indian Kashmiri, Deobandi. So I'm like, well, you've done your 7 years here in Deobandi. I presume you will go back to fight for the freedom of the Kashmiri people. He said, no, I wasn't. I said, why on earth wouldn't you? You're Deobandi, you're a Kashmiri. What's wrong with you? And he goes, I'm not fighting. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'll teach the Quran. I said, well, do you not feel a bit tricky that all your brethren in Pakistan, your Deobandi brethren in Pakistan, they all go to fight, and you're all sitting there teaching the Quran? What good are you? And he says, no, I'm okay with that. I don't want to fight. And that was a reflection of the Indian state having managed to control Deobandi thought in India and to get these guys on a different non-violent path. Now, in Pakistan, if you go to a Deobandi madrasa, the biggest one's on the road from Islamabad to Peshawar, it's a crazy place. I've been there a few times. It's very hostile. And they're up for it. They are up for fighting. They go to Kashmir, they go to Afghanistan, and they fight in Pakistan. I've done a whole lot of stuff on who killed Benazir Bhutto, the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Twice Prime Minister of Pakistan. It was all organised in this madrasa near Peshawar, Deobandi. And when the main mullah there died, unlike in India, which was only about a couple of years ago, killed by a 15-year-old boy in odd circumstances, when he was killed, the Pakistan state turned out to his funeral. Everyone was there. All the military leaders, political leaders, everyone. He was a state guy. The state was supporting him. So that is why, they were encouraging him to be violent. This is all very relevant to the UK, because we've had 2 cases in the last few weeks where people have been released from UK prisons and gone on to violent acts. So that is quite a significant problem. And the Prime Minister has said that they're going to review every case now. I've just read this in the papers. They're going to review every case before releasing. I think it's 220 people who are now not going to be released until they've gone through some sort of review process. So how can it be that the Indians have got a grip on this and we haven't? And that we can't somehow control these guys when they're released from prison? And I suspect, I don't know enough about what the British de-radicalization programs are, but I can tell you that I am familiar with them in Iraq and Yemen and Pakistan and Saudi. And what they're doing there is saying to these young men, look, we quite understand why you want to go on jihad, and of course you want to kill Americans, totally get it. But you should not take that decision on your own. Your government will make that decision. That is the correct religious interpretation. This is a government matter. And that the only thing you've done wrong is not waiting for a government instruction to go and do this. You've done it on your own initiative, and it's wrong. And it works. And the re-offence rate, I'm sure, is more closely monitored here than it is there. But generally speaking, in my observation, having been to quite a few of these places, it was very easy for mullahs to get these guys to fight, like the guy going to the cinema in Lahore, it's just one speech and he's off to become a jihadi. But it's actually very easy to stop them. And you can control it quite easily by these sort of arguments. Now, I suspect they're not using those arguments here in the UK because it's not very palatable to say, look, we quite understand why you want to kill Brits, but you shouldn't do it until you're told to by your government. It's not the sort of argument that the British government's going to sign off on, but maybe more effective. So I suspect that the problem the Brits have got is in the nature of the de-radicalisation programmes. I don't know, I can't be authoritative about this, but something's going wrong in terms of this de-radicalisation, and I think it's something along those lines. So I've spoken for about half an hour. I'm very happy to take questions on any of this, but the big point that I want to get across to you is that don't just see all this violent jihadism and just think violent jihadism. It's not as simple as that. There are hundreds of things going on in terms of the politics behind it, the religious ideology behind it, the ethnicity behind it, social factors, masculinity, class politics. There's a lot going on in these groups and in these young men's heads that drive them to do this stuff, and that the state responses to it need to be quite sophisticated to work, but that the experience of quite a few of these de-radicalisation programmes in the countries most severely affected, it's called not us, places like Pakistan, where literally tens of thousands of people have been killed because of this sort of violence, they are quite good at stopping it, probably better than us. So I'm very glad to take any questions.
Should we first 4 minutes, but we can first give Owen a round of applause, please? Please remember to stand up and say your name and college for our minute as a little incentive. Anyone who does ask questions get invited back to our reading room in 24s where there will be wine afterwards. There you go.
Wine for questions, Gary.
Exactly, yes. Questions fire away? Yes.
Hi, I'm Peter from Liberty College. It seems to me that part of the reason why we have so many multifaceted problems in the region is because of the imposition of an artificial state system on the region. All of these states like Iraq, like Iran, were really, these borders were drawn by people who imperialized the region. So you have nationalists who are fighting for the sovereignty of their nation. Meanwhile, you have cultural groups that are put together by these artificial borders, and that causes infighting. So apart from removing this artificial Westphalian state system, what do you think could be a solution to stopping this violence?
Well, so I don't, that is part of the story. That these borders, the Kashmir conflict is a very good example of it. The Israel-Palestine conflict is another example of that. But what I'm telling you is that there are different things going on as well. Sectarian violence has got nothing to do with that. And probably in Pakistan, as many people have been killed for sectarian reasons as for violent jihadism, anti-state, anti-Western violent jihadism. So, or even anti-Indian violent jihadism. So it's not just borders. Borders are part of the story. But the sectarian violence, the class politics, the sort of Robin Hood element to this, if you take it, the Naxalites in northern India, who are fighting a communist revolutionary struggle against the Indian state, are very similar to the Taliban. Just they're not religious. But they're fighting the same fight in some ways. And I remember a communist in Peshawar. There aren't many left, but there are a few old romantic communists in Peshawar. And he was sat there and said, look, if there's a revolution in Peshawar, and he hoped there would be, it's going to take the form of an Islamic revolution. But it'll be a class revolution, in my analysis, he said, but it will take the form of an Islamic revolution. So it's not just borders. And as I say, I think you asked the question how to resolve this. It is a sophisticated understanding of the motivations that are going on these different levels of the struggle, and working out how to split groups, how to undermine them, how to crush them, how to confuse them, and just playing clever. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do you have any further questions? Yeah, at the back.
Do you think that these countries, particularly in Pakistan, can learn anything from the British actions taken in Northern Ireland with sectarian terrorism? Obviously that was a situation where you have things like a radical socialist element, a religious element, a nationalist element, and then even within religious groups there's different sects of Protestants and different opinions of different Catholics in Northern Ireland, and that has mostly at this point been resolved by successful efforts of the British and Irish states. So do you think that Pakistan really can learn anything from that?
One of Britain's main exports in the last 30 years has been IRA and UPF fighters who've made up going around and telling the world how to solve their problems. I mean, we send them. There's not a conflict in this world that has not had a former Northern Ireland fighter go and lecture them on how to deal with it. And I'm not entirely convinced, because if you take this example, the big thing in Northern Ireland was disarming the IRA, and that became the obstacle for about 4 or 5 years. And at the end of the day, the British state had the power to put the IRA so much on the defensive that they eventually gave in and disarmed. Now, the situation in Pakistan is, they using the Northern Ireland example as their template, so we are now going to mainstream all these militant groups. So a lot of these groups who are absolutely ferocious and kill lots of people are now running for parliament with the blessing of the Pakistan army, who says, this is good because it'll mean they get more interested in politics. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it's not like Northern Ireland. I mean, you've got to disarm them first. And they're like, are you kidding? I mean, there are tens of thousands of them and they've all got guns. We can't possibly disarm them. So it's not a parallel situation, and I think it's an absolute disaster. I mean, these guys are going to have all the guns and be in Parliament. So they'll just be stronger. So it seems to me that the Northern Ireland solution required, basically, the British state to crush the IRA. That is what happened. And it took a long time, and it was slow, and they could still do some attacks towards the end even, but nothing, they realised they could never win. And that's what Gerry Adams basically understood, that he couldn't win, and he was trying to settle it for about, I just wrote something on this actually, he was trying to settle it for about 15 years before he actually managed to settle it. He realised quite early on he couldn't do it. So they were looking for a solution, and I don't think that exists in these other places.
Other questions? Yes, in the middle, yes. Yeah.
Alex Johnson. I was wondering on a more personal level how you're able to talk quite casually about these issues and these stories you sort of firsthand. But how are you able to disassociate that sort of yourself when you're actually in these quite difficult scenarios?
Yes, my son asked me. By blocking it out. So I'm not sure it's very contemporary in terms of mindfulness and that sort of thing. But I just don't go there.
Other questions? Yes.
I just want to ask about domestic anti-terror legislation, and because when we talk about Blair's attempts at anti-terror legislation and what Johnson is currently trying to do with his retrospective stuff, and how it's blocked constitutionally, there are lots of challenges over civil liberties. Instead of it being a civil liberties question, can you shed some light on a sort of effectiveness perspective? How effective are these domestic anti-terror laws at actually combating terrorism?
Well, I think they're very, very difficult to devise. I think it's really difficult. I think some of you, I presume, may apply for the civil service. Am I right? Some of you will want to be civil service. And you may end up in a Home Office trying to devise something like the prevent strategy. So you're faced with some young men in Britain who are on the edge of violent jihadism, watching videos. I think the British basically control the mosques, probably, pretty much. But the back rooms of mosques, still some stuff going on, and all these videos. So how do you actually do it? And Prevent gets this onslaught of complaint. And my wife's a teacher, and she's had to do it, and it's like nonsensical, some of it. But you can see that if you were sitting in Whitehall trying to work out how to devise a policy that would identify young people who are at risk of, and let's face it, at risk of getting themselves killed. I think we've had a case in Syria of a 15-year-old or something going over there and getting himself killed. How would you actually go about doing it? And I suspect most of you, if you were charged with that, would come up with something that looks almost identical to Prevent, even though many of you might think it's oppressive and unsophisticated and clumsy and all the rest of it. It's not easy. And the same is true of these detention orders, which are a gross violation of civil liberties as we understand them in the UK. But we now face a situation, which has just totally justified those detention orders in terms of, 2 innocent Brits on London Bridge were killed. And yesterday, 3 people in Streatham, going about their shopping or something, were stabbed. It's totally unacceptable. And if that involves breaches of our traditionally understood civil liberties, it probably has to happen. But it's difficult because people oppose these measures, for quite good reasons, and we all want to protect our civil liberties. But all I'm trying to say is, these are genuine dilemmas, and if you're in government, I'm sure they look very different and much more difficult than if you're not.
Yes.
Holly Gregory. I was wondering if you thought what you thought the role of the BJP was in all of this, and kind of the tensions that are happening in the movement as well.
So this is the BJP, the nationalist government, Hindu nationalist government that's now running India under the leadership of Narendra Modi, and they have done 2 big things in the last few months. One was impose this constitutional change in Kashmir, where they've basically taken away the idea that it's a disputed territory and just said it's Indian and that's the end of it, against the wishes of most of the people living there. And then this other thing where he's got this immigration law that is clearly discriminatory against Muslims and making it more difficult for Muslims to get Indian citizenship, even if they've been in the country for many, many years. So these are big developments, and they are definitely stoking up a Muslim sense of victimhood, which is always a feature of contemporary Muslim thought anyway. And they're right. I mean, these are discriminatory measures, and it cannot help. And clearly in India, the risks of violent responses are increased as a result of what he's doing.
Excellent. Keep the questions coming. Yes.
Hi, Sam from Aidens. What do you think the key factors were that drove the shift in rhetoric from Tony Blair and David Cameron? Do you think it was like public appeasement or anything like that?
It's a really good question. So why would Blair going from saying this has nothing to do with Islam to saying it's got everything to do with Islam, and David Cameron, both, let's face it, pretty centrist, mainstream politicians. I don't know, you probably have strong views on them, but at the end of the day, they're in the middle of British politics. Not much to distinguish between them, really. And they're both saying, they've both made exactly the same progression from one to the other. And, one of the difficult aspects of this debate, I've been stressing all the non-religious drivers of extremism and violent conduct in the UK. But there is a difficult area, which is Deobandism, for example, even in its most peaceful form, as in Indian Deoband, is very intolerant. And I have intolerant in a way that the Church of England could never imagine being. So, to give you an example of that, I did some programmes for BBC Radio on Deobandis in Britain. Extremely difficult to get anyone to talk. I got about 4 or 5, literally, in Britain there are 600,000 Deobandis. I think I got 4 to talk to me. And one was a cleric in London University. And I said, look, just talk me through this. If you're, because they're quite successful, some of the Deobandis, if you're a Deobandi doctor walking through Birmingham on a Friday, Saturday night, you see all these drunks on the streets, vomiting, which, let's face it, we can see. This decadent, revolting behaviour. What would you think if you were a Deobandi doctor walking through that? I was just exploring how Deobandis might see Britain. And he said, well, if I was a Deobandi doctor walking through that, I would think, you know what? That girl may need medical help, but she's going to hell anyway. So, might as well today as tomorrow. So, I don't think he's far wrong when he says that. So, there is an intolerance that we find difficult, born of religious orthodoxy. And I think that's what Blair and Cameron got hold of. And they're not, it is there. So it's not entirely fictitious. It's when that finds violent expression, obviously that's a whole different ballgame. And that's when it starts becoming problematic in the legal terms and all the rest of it. But there is, I'm very keen to stress the non-religious aspects of this, which are definitely there, but there is also a religious element to it, or can be.
Do we have any last questions? Yeah.
So I was interested by what you said on drones, which was that you now support them but previously opposed them. And I've read somewhere that drone strikes often kill a lot of innocent people and are often deemed to be ineffective because they alienate more people and kind of create more terrorists than they actually kill. And I was just wondering what you thought of that and whether you thought they were generally effective.
Yeah, so I had the sort of standard liberal view on drones that they did those two things. And then I went to work for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism running a project on drones, largely with that thinking in mind. And two things changed my view on it. The first was that the American drone policy changed under Obama. And he, having had in the initial years a really very large number of civilian casualties and some really terrible cases, both in mosques where just innocent young students were killed, and then at weddings where they're just killing 70 people, one thing. Disastrous things. They changed the policy when there was a particularly egregious case, and then Obama said, there must be as near to certainty as is possible, was his phrase. There are no civilians going to be affected. And although no one believes it, I was organising a survey of every drone strike, and we were documenting every single drone strike in northwest Pakistan. It's all there on the Bureau of Investigative Journalism website, you can still see it. And they got it down to something like 3 or 4 civilian deaths a year. Okay, so that was never acknowledged by the liberal critics of drones. The other thing that I was aware of, because I travel in northwest Pakistan in the tribal areas, which is a difficult thing to do, is that the closer you got to the drone strike, the stronger the support, which is counterintuitive, right? But what was happening was these Talibs and Al-Qaeda guys were coming into a village, and they were just absolutely terrible. I mean, they were just beheading people and murdering everyone. And they'd get a hold of a house, and everyone was terrified. And then this drone would come, kill them, and the problem's gone. They said these things are like heaven sent. They just solved the problem of our town. And we got rid of these guys who were murdering all our children. So, as you went further, Peshawar, bit of opposition, Islamabad, quite a bit, Lahore, ferocious anti-American protests. I'm sorry, if you go to the tribal areas, they like this stuff. So, for those two reasons, I did change my view. And then I have to say, I got hold of all this stuff which is in the public domain of Al-Qaeda documentation that was presented in American courts. And it's quite clear. I mean, they said in terms, the thing that stopped them operating was drones. So we think of ourselves as victims of Al-Qaeda. The biggest victims of Al-Qaeda are not us. I mean, we took our punishment in 9/11 and all that. But the biggest victims were Pakistanis, who were being killed every week. There were 2 suicide bombings every week for years in marketplaces. And it stopped because of drones, largely because of drones.
Do you have any last questions?
How do you think the government could more effectively de-radicalise radical prisoners, and what do you think of the success rate for their proposed reform to, do a review before letting them out?
Well, I can understand if you were the government. I mean, I think, again, if you went into the civil service, I think you would find it very difficult to recommend no change in policy. When in 2 weeks running, we've had 2 people going out killing innocent people. I mean, it's a policy dilemma, right? So if you were faced with that, I think you would probably think we need to do something, and a review is like a pretty gentle thing to do. So I can quite understand why they'd want to review it, but the more difficult problem is, that guy who killed 2 people on the bridge was at a de-radicalization seminar run by some very well-meaning, and I'm sure quite clued up people, right? Who were these Cambridge University people who were totally committed to helping these people de-radicalise, and they ended up getting murdered. So it is difficult, because I'm sure those people were not naive who were murdered, the instructors of these courses. So they didn't work out what was going on in that guy's head. And I don't know how you do. So I can see that I think we have got something to learn from Saudi and Pakistan and these places that are dealing with this more often than we are. You know, we've got 220. Yeah, Pakistan, they've got 1 million, right? And they are having to deal with it on a much bigger scale than we are. And I think they have worked out religious arguments that are more effective than we're using, probably.
Do we have one last question? Yeah. Maybe one? Okay, yeah, I can see your hand. Yeah. Go ahead, yes.
You commended Pakistan on their ability to kind of suppress extremist violence and stop reoffending rates by kind of targeting not the core beliefs but the way in which they act on those. But while that might be quite an effective short-term strategy, how do you think it would work in terms of eradicating extremism in the long run? Because whilst those ideologies still lie dormant, presumably when they realise that the state's not going to force them to act on that, they might then return to extremist violence.
Well, I think you know, it's important in all of this to remember that the number of people. Yeah, if I say there are 1 million Pakistanis who are on the fringes of some of this, there are 200 million Pakistanis. Yeah. And Pakistan is probably the most radicalised place in the world. So the vast bulk of the world's Muslims want to do what you do, which is get a job, get a house, have some children, and live happily. So I don't think that we should assume that that isn't achievable for far greater numbers. And I think there will always, this very radical, violent element has been there since the last 10 centuries, and it's always there, but it does come and go. And it's coming now, but you know, I do think effective policy interventions can make it go, and make it, well, eradicate it, but make it much more, less of a problem than it is now.
Excellent. So if you do think of a question, perhaps on your way back, Randy, please feel free to come and collect a card and come back, because we'll try and fit you in. I always think of the best questions after a talk is finished. So please feel free to do that. But other than that, please can we give Owen another round of applause for an extremely insightful talk.